Crime Network, everybody. I am Michael Bryant. Yes, I'm an attorney, but today I'm identifying as a candy cane. So I'm ready to go here. We got a lot to do, and I've been forced to cram this into 1 hour. So stay with us here. For this next hour, we're going to be discussing the trial against two paramedics charged in the death of Elijah McClain. Jeremy Cooper and Peter Cichuniec are the paramedics involved in this ultimate death. They're charged with homicide for what they did back in 2019, maybe what they didn't do, all related to the death of 23-year-old Elijah. So the jury deliberating as we speak. They are out. They got the case yesterday. They should be back about now. It's about 10 o'clock out in Colorado. If you recall, McClain was placed in a chokehold during a police encounter. And when the paramedics came along, he was injected with Special K, ketamine, which has been in the news so much lately, from Matthew Perry to, of course, Maya Kowalski. That, if you get too much ketamine, guess what happens? Maybe a heart attack. So he's sent into cardiac arrest. He dies later in the hospital. The defendant's charged with criminally negligent homicide, manslaughter, second-degree assault. A lot of cases related to this. They tried the cops separately, and we're going to talk about all these varied results and whether they testified, whether they didn't. In this case, both defendants took the stand in their own defense. And Cichuniec was first up. So let's tune into some of his direct examination.
Prior to going up to see where the ambulance was, did you see the officers do anything with Mr. McClain?
I did. At one point, I saw the officers, or I heard them say, "I told you to stop doing it," something to that effect. And then I don't know, I can't recall from that time, I can't recall exactly what I heard from either one of them, but I saw one of the officers pick Mr. McClain up and just body slam him hard into the ground.
And this was prior to you turning and going to look for the ambulance?
That was right before I walked back to see where our ambulance was, because we needed them. We need our tools, we need our ambulance there, and they weren't there yet.
What effect did that body slam, as you put it, have on you in that moment?
Well, my sense of urgency got a little broader. We needed to get our tools there. We needed to tend to Mr. McClain, and we needed to help him as soon as we can.
Okay, so you go out onto Billings Street to see if the ambulance is coming, right?
That's correct.
It's not.
Correct.
Or at least you can't see it, right?
And it's dark out, so I would see the reflection from the lights, and I did not see that either direction.
Okay. And so do you start back toward the group at that point?
I do. I started heading back to the group to see if anything has changed.
And what happens while you're en route back to the group?
On my way back, Fireman Cooper called out to me and said, "When they get here, can we get their narcs and restraints?" And narcs are narcotics. So those are controlled substances that we keep locked up in a lockbox on our engine, and Falk does the same on their ambulance. And restraints is just a term for soft restraints. Instead of handcuffs, which are hard restraints, we use soft restraints on a pram for any time a patient is a harm to themselves or other, we restrain them to the pram.
And the pram is also known as a gurney, right?
It is. The pram is known as a gurney, stretcher, pram.
Okay. And can you describe for the jury the reason why it was Falk Ambulance that was in possession of those tools that you needed rather than the engine?
Yes. So simply, we don't have a pram or a stretcher on our ambulance or on our engine. That's on the ambulance. Same with the restraints. We don't carry soft restraints in any of our kits or on our engine. And the biggest one is the medication we needed for Mr. McClain was ketamine. And at the time, it was on back order for us, so we did not carry it. We didn't have it on our engines yet, so we had to rely on what Falk carried.
How long had, to your knowledge, how long had ketamine been approved for use by AFR?
I would say at least a year, probably a year and a half.
Okay, not a big fan of the split screen there, but it's good to be inside the courtroom, so I'm not complaining. Let's get into this case and contrast it with what happened in the prior cases related to some of the officers that were involved in the death of Elijah McClain. Joining me this afternoon, I have attorney Catherine Lizardo and also criminal defense attorney Jeffrey Wolf. Good to see you guys. Good to be here. Catherine, you weren't here last Friday. I just stormed off. I didn't even stick around, so I'm not sure what happened. But thank you for making your Friday appearance here today. And Jeff, always good to have you. Let me start with you, Jeff. In part of this testimony, we heard the phrase, an officer, quote, body slammed the decedent to the ground. I mean, is that necessary? Is it inflammatory? Is it designed to, kind of heighten the jury's concern for what happened that day?
It's part and parcel for what we're seeing from the defense in all of these Elijah McClain cases. As we know, the judge in her infinite wisdom early on in the prosecution of this death decided to sever all of these cases. And it doesn't happen a lot out here in Colorado. This is my home. I grew up in Aurora. Elijah McClain died in my city. So I'm going to continue to say his name. And this doesn't happen in Colorado. They don't allow co-defendants to point the finger at each other from different trials with different juries very often out here. It's a pretty high standard. I've requested severance of charges of co-defendants more times than I can count. Never once had it granted, but I never represented a bunch of cops who killed a guy. So they allowed this jury to basically listen to the cops point the finger at each other by having separate trials, 2 cops in one trial, a 3rd cop in another, and now they're letting the paramedics do the same thing. And this is exactly what they're all doing, is they're pointing the finger at each other, saying everything was fine on my end, it was that guy who's the problem. And instead of letting the jury hear the totality of the circumstances and have to judge all 5 of these men together, they're letting this circus happen, and it's disgusting to watch.
It is. I'll ask you a follow-up on that. Stand by here, Catherine. Why do you think this happened? In your practice there, you don't see it often. You've asked for it, didn't get it. What's the deal? What's going on here?
Cops. It's the system protecting the system. It's exactly what it is. They had 3 cops and 2 paramedics charged. They are fighting against the social justice movement in this country that is actually having people held accountable for their actions when they're in positions of power like this. And this was a senseless, needless death that would not even have been prosecuted. Hear that again. Would not even have been prosecuted by this DA's office if it wasn't for the social justice movement in the summer of 2020. This is a death that predates the social justice movement in this country. And there were so many phone calls to the Adams County District Attorney's Office that when I would call there to talk to a DA, it would tell me if I had something to say about Elijah McClain. It gave me a different phone number. And eventually they had to send it to a grand jury. The grand jury indicted all 5 of these gentlemen as co-defendants, and the judge allowed them to sever the trial and run this defense. It is gross. It is causing acquittals where it otherwise wouldn't. And it is not the norm in Colorado. They are being treated differently. They are being treated special.
Well, and it has. And Catherine, I want to listen to the cross first, and I'm going to come back to you to talk about the varying outcomes in these severed cases. Let's go now to the cross-examination of this defendant.
You indicated that you were the one who went over and ordered up the ketamine from the Falk ambulance. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
You ordered that ketamine in a dosage of 500 milligrams.
Correct, 500.
Prior to doing that, you and Mr. Cooper didn't have a conversation about how much Mr. McClain weighed.
We had a conversation on the dose.
Right. And you both just agreed 500.
Yes.
But under your estimate of Mr. McClain's weight, the appropriate dose would have only been 425.
Correct.
The reason you moved it up to 500 is because you thought he was extra agitated.
I moved it up to 500 because of the training we were given on ketamine, when we were taught to give either 300 for small, 400 for medium, and 500 for large. So I went off the training that we were given.
Now, Mr. Cichuniec, one of the reasons you went up from 425 to 500 is because you thought he had a particularly agitated state and was showing signs and symptoms of excited delirium.
That is correct. And I'm not going to under-medicate someone by giving them 400. I'm going to go up to the next one per our training.
Now, in your training, there's nothing in there that says, give more if you think they have strong symptoms.
Right. There's nothing printed in the PowerPoint, but those were, as we all heard Mr. Chambers talk about, that he builds off of that, and there's side conversations that go off of that. And that's where we were taught, we were trained to go 300, 400, 500.
I'm not asking about those starting points of 3, 4, 5. I'm asking about whether or not there is anything in the training that says increase the dose if you think somebody's extra agitated. That's not in there, is it?
Not written in there, no.
And that's not part of one of those side conversations either.
That training was back in 2018, so I couldn't recall every side conversation.
Right. So you have no memory of a side conversation that would say, increase the dose if you think they're extra agitated.
No, I do not.
So if you increased the dose because he was extra agitated, that would not be consistent with your training.
Repeat, I'm sorry. Let me clarify so I can make sure I answer it.
If you increase the dose because of his agitation level, that would be inconsistent with your training.
I disagree.
Didn't you just testify that the training doesn't say that you increase the dose if somebody is extra agitated?
Right.
And you have no memory of any other training side conversation that would say that's okay.
Not for the extra agitation, as you call it.
Right.
So remember, the wrinkle we have here that's different from, let's say, George Floyd, is you have the EMTs involved, and they are defendants in this part of the case. Catherine Lozardo is here. You got Jeffrey Wolf. So, Catherine, I'm looking back, trying to keep straight all the different cases that Jeff says were improperly severed here, and we have one cop tried separately. We have two cops tried together. When the two were tried together, and that was Jason Rosenblatt and Randy Roedema, one comes out guilty, one comes out not guilty, and is fully acquitted. How do you figure that? I mean, obviously, it's very fact-specific, who did more than the other might have done, but it kind of refutes Jeff's concern that by pointing fingers at one another, even in that one trial, it would, slop over from one defendant to the other, and it didn't when you had two totally different outcomes for these guys.
It was very surprising to have two different outcomes in the same trial. Roedema was found guilty, but for a lesser count of criminal negligence and assault instead of the manslaughter that he was charged with. And he was the one that was on top of McClain and had a lot more physical interaction with McClain. I believe maybe that's why the jury found him guilty of the lesser charge compared to the other defendant, the other police officer. But being in the same trial, yes, they were still pointing at each other. And we see here, even with the paramedics, that they too were pointing at each other, even though they were both at the same trial. Whether or not they were severed or together, that was their defense strategy and it worked for them. But I agree with Jeff that it doesn't make sense to sever all five of them, in those different kinds of the way they were organized. I don't even know why certain people were tried separately or together, but, for judicial economy and for the jury here.
As we continue to cover this case, guys, I want to break down, who testified, who did not, and what that impact might have been, and see if we can glean anything from that, because both EMTs did testify, as you know. We're looking at one of them right now. Let's take a break. We will come back, talk more about this case. Again, we are in verdict watch in this Colorado case. There we are.